Hello everyone, my name is Millie and I'm here to unpack the events in the last week surrounding the World Health Assembly and the potential for a pandemic treaty in 2024. I'm going to be laying out the distinction between these two things because they are two separate things. And I'm going to be explaining exactly what the functional role is of the international health regulations that are being amended, and also what that means in relation to the potential for a pandemic treaty set to begin the official drafting stage on the 1st of August. 2022. There is some crossover in terms of the potential to affect each other, but overall I just want to set out the distinction between the two and our ability to contest any concerns within those two as well. The running theory on the internet is that after the 22nd of May, the UN is going to have total control over this country and the functions within it in terms of a health crisis, and as is the WHO. This is not the case. The amendments that are within that document, it's a 13-page document, they serve a function to improve international pandemic response and communication. So the document itself, it's really more so focused on our ability to trade between countries, our ability to send people out, should we request that they be sent out. As it stands now, the international health regulations serve to mostly change the organizational structure of the WHO. Not so much how we respond as a country, other than the time constraints in terms of our response. The 48-hour window to respond is now a 24-hour window to respond. And for the most part, it just speeds up the process of establishing a health emergency to warn people of a potential health threat. And that's really reflective of removing the privacy barriers. Because it takes the World Health Organization time to fly out or gather evidence to confirm a health threat, they've really just said, we're going to start the process of talking to other countries that might be impacted about the fact that we have received reports that there might be something going on. So there's no real breach of any human rights in this capacity. It really is about efficiency with communication, because in the early stages of the original pandemic, we had an issue when it came to timely reports of what was going on between countries. And I'm not going to name those countries, but when you think about the epicenter of the original problem, it starts to make sense as to why they would want to speed things up a bit. So when you look at the intended purpose of the amendments, it makes sense that people would want to improve that process, and you can't really argue that anything within that is sinister. The amendments are very consistent from top to bottom. There's no language used that reflects any mandatory nature of these agreements. It very much is the same where our country can request services from the WHO, but we can also reject them as well. So it remains unchanged in that capacity. But what has changed in terms of what may be a potential concern is really the WHO's ability to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And I can see the intended purpose within the document, but when it comes to the process of ratifying such an agreement, it is something we would want to be on alert for as we go to push things through our parliament that reflect these. Issue is that it's not very clear in terms of whether or not we can end the declaration of a public health emergency. And that is in direct context with if there is a pandemic treaty that is successfully agreed upon in 2024 that does give the WHO rights over this country, this legislation, this particular clause in Article 12, could become an issue should those two things marry up. I encourage everyone watching to actually read it because it's very educational in terms of our ability to understand what's going on in things like the World Health Assembly, but also to really see the difference between what is an actionable mandate that we've seen in some of our own legislation and what it looks like to have open consent-based legislation, which is what this is within the IHR. This is why it's really important to support our minor parties this election, because it's the minor parties that are going to be pushing for amendments and making sure that our legislation goes in line with our constitutional rights as well. So to recap, the international health regulations seem to be badly worded in certain areas. That wording may not directly translate to what gets put forward into potential legislation in this country, but it is important that we're all on the same page so we can track that and we can present our exact concerns as efficiently as possible. I really think that if we all learned how to read legislation at a base level, we would be much better for it. There would be less panic, less miscommunication and concern. And I think overall we would have a better representation of people that understand how to reject something if it does come into conflict with our human rights. So if you have the time, I really urge you to take a look at those. Moving on to the pandemic treaty. Now, this is due to begin its drafting phase officially on August 1st. They've got proposed things that they want to put into a draft. They haven't quite finalized it and narrowed it down into a first draft, but the process is really August 1st. I'm not sure when we will get to see a first draft of what is proposed within this pandemic treaty, but we can't really go commenting on what is within it when we don't actually know, and that's the issue here. But what we can do is say, under no circumstances do we agree to let any external organisation internationally interfere with what happens on Australian soil. And that needs to be the base level messaging, because when we start to go into theories about what they may do in the event that there is a pandemic treaty, we lose credibility because we have no current evidence to back up our claims. And this is where assessing things as they arise comes into play, and providing supporting evidence also comes into play as well. Now, I saw the videos where Scott Morrison expressed support for the WHO having further powers over how this country operates. I also saw Anthony Albanese go in favour of it as well. Their opinions are irrelevant to what happens within our democratic system. And I believe Scott Morrison misused the word power, because that power cannot so easily be bestowed to another organisation. That's a very long and lengthy process that isn't actually up to him. If there was anything sinister within this pandemic treaty of 2024, and we don't know that yet, but if there were, it would still be upheld to basic democratic principles, which means that it has to pass the lower house and the upper house to be introduced to law. If the pandemic treaty is in conflict with our constitution or our human rights, which it would be if we were to say that we want the WHO to have authority over this country, then that's a situation where we the people get to decide via referendum. To pass anything through a referendum successfully, you need the majority of people within the country to be in favour of it. But not just that, you also need the double majority, which means the majority of states and territories have to have the majority of people within them in support of that. So if we are outnumbered in terms of states and territories that disagree with any given piece of legislation that conflicts with our constitutional rights, it will not be successfully passed through. On this premise alone, it is extraordinarily difficult for the government to pass any legislation in conflict with our constitution, and they would have a very difficult time convincing the majority of Australians to cede our sovereignty to an external organisation. So far, the main source of corruption within our democratic system exists under emergency legislation, and it's important to remember that when we think about what that looks like in contrast with introducing permanent legislation that may override our constitutional rights. The emergency legislation in force now seeks to pause them. If you haven't read the Biosecurity Act of 2015, I encourage you to do so, because it is the most important active legislation we have in this country. And that is what gives the government the ability to issue things like control orders and restrict our freedom. I understand why it seems like our system is corrupt to the point where we can't block these things from coming into effect, and I get it. But that is through the use of emergency legislation and people intentionally twisting and stretching that legislation to overreach in areas that they shouldn't have. That isn't in the sense of introducing permanent legislation that overrides our human rights. And we still have those mechanisms within our democracy to block it. Throughout this process, it is really important to remember what a treaty is, the power that is inherently within a treaty, and also the process of officializing any given treaty when we look at a situation like this and seek to respond. Our system so far at the moment is quite good in a few ways, one of which being that if there are any major changes to any given agreement that does already exist, we have a federal executive council that runs over that in terms of what is being introduced into our system. After the 2-year-long headache, you would think that our democracy is already in the toilet and that there's nothing we can do, but it's not true. It's all based behind the word emergency, and that's how they twist things and get away with certain concepts. And that is where I think this gets dangerous, because if we have people that believe there's nothing we can do, there will be nothing that we do. Doing nothing is what's going to cause evil to triumph in any given situation. And that's why, if you are concerned about this, you need to walk the walk. Tell everyone about how to vote cards. Tell everyone the freedom parties exist. You need to show up to the poll booths and act like it. Whether that means making your vote count and telling as many other people to make their votes count, or that means you come down and volunteer, that's fine. Everything you do can create a chain reaction for the better. That is your power as a human being. That is our power as a community. We have the ability to step up and defend our democracy. It's not going to save itself. So please do what you can to help.
Authorised by Jammal, W.H.A, Melbourne.